go. So what I want to do today is to talk about a very specific historic event, which was an outbreak of witch hunting in Aberdeen and the wider Northeast area in 1597, and to talk about it in a way that will sort of resonate, I think, with some of the things we talk about today, which is sort of terrorism in the sense of a conspiracy to do wrong to society, and profiling. In other words, how do you know who to think might be dangerous? And as you'll see, this is an issue that very much resonates in this specific historic event as an example of witch hunts more generally. So to begin, certain factors had to be present and were anywhere in Europe when there was a witch panic. First, there had to be a general belief that some people were using magical, that is, sort of supernatural powers. These might be used for good or ill, to cure or harm, to bless or curse. And prior to about 1500, maybe a little bit earlier, people considered confessions to witchcraft to be delusional. In other words, they didn't think it was real, but something changes in the late 15th century and it becomes real. And this explains why it then becomes a crime. So most European countries actually make witchcraft a crime in the 1500s. They now consider it real and a threat, and they pass legislation. In Scotland in 1563, the Reformation government passed the Witchcraft Act. England under Henry VIII had already done so in 1543, and this was strengthened by a later Elizabethan Act in 1563. And in 1604, James VI and First strengthened the Elizabethan Act for the entirety of Great Britain. Charges had to relate to actual events initially, and this is important, initially, which could be examined with witnesses. In other words, you couldn't just point to someone on the street and say, there's a witch. And this explains the fact that many people were acquitted of the charge. In other words, these specific accusations fell down. And across Europe, about 60% of accusations never moved beyond an investigation or actually ended in acquittal. A panic usually followed a particularly notorious trial, in other words, something high profile, in which more than one person was implicated. And as we will see, that was the case in Aberdeen in 1597. Once the idea took root that there was a conspiracy, a plot, a witch cell, or as we would maybe something like a terrorist cell, ideas about contracts with Satan, covens of witches, and Sabbaths took over with the more normative type of evidence about things like potions and curses. This made the whole conspiracy easier to convict for reasons we will see. Now, the initial trial in Aberdeen involved an investigation into a single family, John Lays and his wife, Janet. Isabel Cockey, who appears to have been unrelated, was also named. She might have been a relative, but we don't know. They seem to have been implicated by Helen Gray, who was one of a handful of women investigated around Slains slightly prior to this, so in January. Janet and Isabel were quickly convicted and executed by 17th February. They were charged with harming people through magic, in other words, specific accusations, but there's little in their trials which was interesting or, from the point of view of Aberdeen, alarming. John Lays and his 3 daughters appear to have been released or acquitted. Not quite sure. The panic truly took hold, though, with the investigation into Thomas, which we'll discuss in just a moment. The initial specific commission, which had been granted by the Privy Council to investigate the Slains women and the Lays family, was seen by the authorities in Aberdeen as inadequate. And so they requested a more open-ended 5-year commission from the Privy Council, and this was granted, to find and try all witches in the Northeast. And the commission was placed in the hands of Alexander Rutherford, Provost of Aberdeen, and Thomas Leslie, Sheriff Depute. What had happened? What had made the city think they had such a serious problem on their hands that they wanted this open-ended ability to investigate? The answer becomes clear when we turn to Thomas's trial. Thomas Lays confessed, undoubtedly under coercion, of having led a coven of witches in a dance at the Fish Cross the previous Halloween. In other words, a satanic party right in front of the toll booth with demons and Satan and dancing and undoubtedly cannibalistic practices and certainly sex with Satan and demons. Thomas implicated a number of women, as you can see, including his mother, though she was already dead. So in effect, he's not endangering her. She's already been executed. The other women on the slide were arrested and tried. On the 9th of March, Mitchell, Tom, Barron were executed. Menteith had already hanged herself in her cell, and Mackey had died in jail. It's worth pointing out that Christian at this point in time is both a male and female name, and this Christian is female. At this point, the commissioners, Rutherford and Leslie, looked out with Aberdeen. So the question facing the investigators was, we think we have a serious problem on our hands. We think we have a conspiracy trying to destroy our society. Where do we turn next to find more of these witches, to uncover more conspiratorial cells? Well, they went to Lumphanan. That sounds unbelievable to anyone who's ever been there. It's very, very small now. It was a mere hamlet then, so why? I don't think it was because of any association with Macbeth. Rather, it's probable that someone either in the Slains group of arrested women or the Leys family had mentioned the place. Or even more likely, as we'll see, is associated with a witch accused in 1591, the previous spectacular hunt. Now, the investigation in Lumphanan involved not only Rutherford and Leslie, but extensive cooperation between them as commissioners from the city and the Catholic Earl Huntley, as well as John Ross, the Protestant minister of Lumphanan. Thus, the events can't be seen as a Protestant hunt seeking latent Catholics or traditional Catholic practices. The initial investigation involved Margaret Bain, a midwife, who was identified as the sister of Janet Spaldar, who, along with a woman named Grant, had been executed as a witch in 1591. In other words, if you're looking for more conspirators, you look at the place you found them the last time. Now, this links this trial somewhat tenuously with the witch trials associated with North Berwick and the plot to kill James VI and his new wife, Anne of Denmark, in 1591 by a diabolical storm as they returned from Norway, Denmark. The names now poured forth as Bain was questioned and almost certainly coerced through deprivation of food, drink, and sleep, if not the actual threat or use of physical violence. Isabel Burnett, widow of the Laird of Cloak, and her daughter, Elspeth Forbes, fled to Edinburgh and were protected from further investigation by the Privy Council. And this introduces an issue of the extent to which status is an element of whether you fit the image of the persons they're looking for. On the 24th of April, the two Og women, Ritchie and Roche, were all executed. The next day, Ferries was executed. The two unnamed women were acquitted, reminding us that even during panics, conviction was not assured. Nevy, who's from the area around Lumphanan, was also executed about this time, and we assume connected with this particular group. Before moving on, let's pause for just a moment to consider how the deaths of so many women would have affected such a small community. This is a substantial portion of the adult female population of Lumphanan. However, even before these trials ended, attention had shifted to Buchan. Again, why? Buchan seems to have come to the attention of the commissioners out of the trial of Helen Gray. Now, remember, we've already mentioned her, and she's still alive at this point and still giving information. She had implicated Helen Penny, who was Gerard's mother. So, first of all, the commissioners looked at the last place they had found witches, conspirators, terrorists, and this time they're actually looking for relatives of people that have been previously arrested or implicated. Marion Wood alone was acquitted. The other 3 women were executed. Now, a few more trials happened, but there is little information about these which survives. The cost, however, was tremendous. The number of women killed approached 3 dozen. Nearly 80 were investigated, and we can presume faced either actual coercion or at least the fear of arrest for a capital crime. In other words, they knew that if they were investigated, they could be executed. There was also a substantial financial cost. In a normal year, this sum was equivalent to the entire amount of cash which the city would have received from one of its major sources of income, which was burying wealthy citizens inside St. Nicholas Kirk. And that was a source of income so important that the city continued to allow the practice, even though it was technically illegal. And this cost is not the cost of the commissioners. That was in addition. This £165 was just what it cost to execute them. The cost to the executioner and the firewood and things like that to burn their corpses after they had been garroted. So the question then arises, why so many people? 3 key factors explain in part how these trials worked. So first, the concept of cause and effect was different. For example, if a poor elderly woman approached someone for assistance and was rejected, she might well walk away muttering. If the person who had refused help then fell ill, they might associate the 2 events. More importantly, they might associate them days, weeks, months, or even years later. In other words, slightly out of order on my slide, the way memory works is important here, and even more so in a world where correlation and causation often did go right together. So much as we do when we are asked about an accused criminal's behavior, which only seems strange in the light of the charge. Considerable research shows the dangers of eyewitness testimony, especially after time has passed. And let me give you a perfectly good example. If you live in the countryside and some new people moved in a farm nearby and took delivery of lots and lots of fertilizer, you might just think, well, they're new to farming, they don't really know how much they need. And then a week later, a fertilizer bomb goes off somewhere and the police come around and they say, did you notice anything suspicious? And you would say, well, yes, I did. They took a delivery of a lot of fertilizer. Well, yes, you thought that was suspicious, but you thought it was suspicious because they didn't know what they were doing, not because you thought they were going to explode. So there are some really interesting issues here about how memory works. Second, being accused of flying through the air or worshiping Satan cannot be proven. It can only be confessed. Torture and coercion were key and included sleep deprivation, starvation, thirst, as well as more conventional forms of torture, though normally it tended to be the deprivation variety. And everyone knew what to confess. They knew the answers. And I'll give you an example of how that would work. If you were tortured and asked about being abducted by an alien, you would know what to confess. What happened when you were abducted? There was a bright light. There was invasive probing. The aliens were little gray or green men, etc. Despite the fact that none of this actually happened, you would know what to answer because in our culture, there's sort of a story that goes along with this, and it's the same for theirs. They were told what witches did at Sabbath, so when they were asked about it, they knew what to answer. In reality, this meant that specific cause and effect bizarrely connected might start a trial, but things like knowing the answers to stuff that can't be actually proven, linked with coercion, did the rest. In reality, when a society decided it was facing a conspiracy of witches, it knew where to look. Previous witches, family relationships with witches, and what to look for. In other words, there was in the minds of the people of 1597 an image of a witch. If you said to someone, what is a witch? Who is a witch? That produces a visual image that they can then describe. In effect, this was a profile. If you fit the profile, you might be targeted. If you fit the profile, you were much less likely to be targeted. So, for example, the people that ran off, the mother and daughter that ran off to Edinburgh, they didn't really fit the pattern, and so they were able to get protection. And if you were targeted and you fitted the pattern, you had about a 50-50 chance of being convicted and possibly executed. In other words, profiling was alive and well in the 16th century. And it was as dubious and as dangerous then as now. It was also as likely to be used and as useful from the point of view of the authorities then as now. Thank you very much. You're more than welcome to ask any questions you might have.
Thank you very much for that, Bill. Okay, so we will open the floor for questions. I'm sure there's lots of questions or discussion points people have got. So if you've got something you'd like to ask, please just pop it into the chat at the side there, and I will read it out for you. We've had a couple of round of applause emojis already for you, Bill, so that's a good start. So, okay, the first question. Eleanor is asking, first of all, she says, that's fascinating, thank you. How detailed are the source documents? Are whole conversations recorded?
Right. One of the problems we have with many of the documents for witch trials in Scotland is that they vary dramatically in the level of detail. So when I said, for example, in Lumfannon, 2 women were acquitted and we don't even know their names. So we just know that there were 2. We know that about 80 were investigated, but the majority of them, we don't even know their names. So this is an issue we face in using Scottish records with this, which sometimes is similar to what you would find, say, on the continent, but other places you'll have much more detailed records. So very often whole conversations aren't recorded, though occasionally you do get sections of testimony. So it really depends on what is surviving. In some cases, what survives are the ditties, which are kind of the written down almost verbatim testimony in a question and answer session, but sometimes what we get are sort of a précis of that, which is nice because you can do statistics with it, but it makes it much more difficult to do anything really useful because you'd want the detail.
The next question is from David, and he says, what changed to make people take witchcraft seriously instead of considering confessions delusional as before?
Well, I like this question because it's a great question, and you'll like the answer. We don't know. The reality is there is something that is going on in the mindset in the late 15th century, where something that if you confessed to it, so if you went to your priest in 1450 and said, at night I changed my form and I went to a meeting and I saw Satan, the priest would give you penance to do and really think that the issue there was a problem of delusion. If you confess the same thing in 1550, you're almost certainly going to be executed. Now, I think it's hard to understand how that can happen, but let me give you an example. In the 1950s, American society very largely became convinced that there were communists everywhere, hence the McCarthy trials. If you had asked people that in the 1930s, they would have thought that idea was a bit strange. And likewise, 20 years later, they would have found it strange. So something happens in the society that explains why all of a sudden this becomes believable and terrifying. And we don't know what the answer is.
Thank you. Richard wants to know, who did the torturing and executing?
So executing would have been done by normally someone employed by the city to do their executions for them. Torturing, now Scotland doesn't actually have judicial torture, and most of the torture that's used is what we would euphemistically nowadays call enhanced interrogation techniques, by which I mean they tend to be almost the kind of things of like brainwashing. So Scotland and other jurisdictions employed people that were called watchers and wakers and walkers. So someone would watch you in the cell, and if you fell asleep, they would wake you up and they would keep you walking to keep you awake, to keep you sleep deprived.
Thank you very much. Fanny is asking, how much was King James involved in the idea behind witch hunts? Did he see it as important to rid the country of witches, or was this not on his mind?
A great question, and he's very involved, and it was very much on his mind, because in 1591 he becomes convinced that a group of witches tried to kill him and his wife. And the result is that James becomes the only reigning monarch to ever serve as a judge in a witch trial. He also becomes the only reigning monarch to write a book about witchcraft. He writes his Demonology, which is a treatise on witchcraft. Originally, it circulates in manuscript and is clearly aimed at his sons so that they will know when they become powerful how to find witches. But it's published in 1597. It's not the publication that sparks what happens in Aberdeen. It appears that what happens in Aberdeen sparks the publication. In other words, witchcraft is all of a sudden a big issue, and some publisher realizes this is a great time to bring out the book, I can sell it.
Okay, thank you. Jackie is asking, where can I find info about the Lumphanan witches?
There's two articles written about the 1597 witchcraft trials, one by Julian Goodare and one by Peter Maxwell Stewart in the journal Northern Scotland. And they will point you to where the sources are. They are obviously in manuscript and mostly held in Aberdeen in the city archives, but some of them were published in extract form in the 19th century. So I would go to those particular articles in Northern Scotland by Julian Goodare and Peter Maxwell Stewart, and in their notes you'll find the best places to find stuff that's at least been published.
Very much. Gwendolyn is asking, are you working only from court records, or do you have other sources available?
Yeah, most of what we're working with is the records that are produced as a result of the commissions and their investigations. So they are, we would think of them as like police investigation files as well as court transcript type files, but they're all involved coming out of the actual investigation.
Miranda is asking, did Thomas Lees get off without punishment for taking part in the coven dance and all? And she says, sorry if that was answered.
No, it wasn't. As far as we know, he may have been executed. He may not have been. It's one of the annoying things that very often in Scotland, you know when someone is accused and you don't know what happens, or you get the middle of the trial and not the beginning or the end. And his is one of the ones where common sense would say that he's going to be executed, but we just can't be sure.
Thank you. So Roderick is asking, were there differences as to who tried the witches? Sometimes it seems to have been church authorities and sometimes the civic.
Right. Well, the simple answer to that is that in most cases they're the exact same group. So to the extent that the church is involved, so I mentioned the minister in Lumphanan. In actual fact, what you're talking about is the session, which is lay elders, as the session would still be today, and one minister. But in this period, most of those lay elders are also bailies or burgesses or provosts or something like that. They hold political office, civic offices as well. So the question is what hat do they have on their head when they're yelling at you or interrogating you? But they're the same people.
Thanks. Which one's next? Amanda is asking, at what point was burning at the stake as a form of execution changed to garroting?
Right. Well, this is a good question because it's one of the things that is often not very obvious when people talk about this in historical stuff. Burning at the stake almost always means burning your dead body at the stake. So you're tied to the stake and you are then throttled by a garrote, and then your dead body is burned. Burning people alive was very, very rare for obvious reasons. I mean, burning a body would be horrific enough. Burning a person alive would be truly, truly horrific. So the point of burning someone is the idea that you face the destruction of your corpse, which has sort of ideas about the ability to face resurrection and stuff like that. So that's why it's the burning that takes place. In actual fact, being hanged was probably as truly as awful as this, but at least you had a corpse that could then be buried.
Thank you very much. So Anne Minto says it's a great talk. Belle says hardly recognised you without your beard. And she says, when was this horrible torture and killing of women accused of being witches ended for good in Scotland?
Well, glad you're here, Anne, and nice to see you kind of via chat. Pretty much most places in Europe, the prosecution of witches tails off in the middle of the 1600s. Now, people continue to be accused, and this is an interesting feature. So what happens almost everywhere in Europe, judges and lawyers come to the conclusion that you cannot get a safe confession because of what I was hinting about, the fact that everyone knows the answers. And so they stop, as a profession, prosecuting. The rest of the population thinks people are still witches and continues to accuse them. But by and large, the state just doesn't participate. So what you often find is you will get later examples of people being killed, but it's more likely to be as a result of sort of mob violence or lynching rather than something the state is doing. Interesting, the first group that comes to the conclusion that you cannot get a safe confession and therefore stops prosecuting witches is in fact the Spanish Inquisition around 1610. So the Spanish Inquisition stops doing this long before just about anyone else in Europe does.
Thank you very much. So Emma's asking, she says, so when people started trialing witches, did they just spontaneously do this, or was there something happening, such as murders, crimes, sketchy stuff, that they wanted to blame the witches for?
Yeah, this is one of the problems, because very often the point at which we come into the story, in other words, the records survive, doesn't start early enough for us often to understand why particular people are being accused. Now, there have been a couple of really good studies done on the continent where they've got good records in a particular town or something like that, which suggests that some of the initial accusations have to do with interpersonal conflict, and also this kind of concept of profiling. So you wouldn't just accuse anyone of witchcraft, and very often it's women accusing other women. And because men have recourse to other ways of getting what they want and hurting people and things like that, they tend to not be accused of witchcraft unless they are the spouse of a witch. So what seems to spark it off initially is you have someone in the community who is understood to have access to power. So for example, in the same way you might have a community today and you go, oh yeah, everyone knows, Morag, she's got second sight. Now, by and large, most people might think, oh, that's kind of cool. Someone's with second sight. That might be useful until you decide that Morag is misusing second sight and then you don't like her anymore. And that seems to be the dynamic that what's going on. There is someone that everyone kind of thinks has access to power, which can be useful. So they don't have access to doctors or things like that. You need someone that might cure you, and they can cure you by rituals and mutterings and phrases and things like that. But they might also make your child ill. And so what tips it over to the point at which the society decides you're no longer useful and you're now dangerous, and that seems to be the point at which they involve the authorities in it.
So Rosie's asking, what do you think is behind the resurgence of interest in practicing of witchcraft now?
They're just utterly unrelated, to be perfectly honest. What is going on in the 16th and 17th century is much more a clash between what educated people understand about witchcraft. In other words, they understand it to be people in league with Satan in a conspiracy to destroy godly society. And what local people think is going on, which is we've got this cool old woman in our village that helps people when they get ill. In other words, if you go to any pre-modern society today and you walked up to someone and said, "Who's the witch doctor in town?" they're going to point to someone. That's not bizarre. What's bizarre is that in 16th and 17th century Europe, people think that those people are in league with Satan. So, but modern witchcraft is much more associated with a sort of neo-paganism and things like that, and really has a resurgence in the late 19th century where it just kind of appears more than anything else. So that they are really quite distinct things.
Thank you. Rosemary's asking, do you think those convicted should receive a pardon from the Scottish Government? Because there's a campaign ongoing now, and do you think there should be a public memorial to them?
I don't know. I've never actually even thought about it. I mean, partially because, to be perfectly honest, so many of the executions that happened in the period I work with were almost certainly unfair and wrong by any sense that we would understand that word. I mean, the reality is, you know, a 12-year-old being executed for stealing a half a loaf of bread shocks us, I think, as much as people being accused of witchcraft and executed. So so that's kind of problematic, and that's why I don't think I've ever even thought about it. A public memorial, I think that might be something that's much more worthwhile thinking about, just to remind us of the way in which a society can be overtaken by panic. And in that social panic, in that moral panic, target specific groups and individuals in their own society and blame them. And to that extent, it's probably worth, you could do that with witches, you could do that with Jews, you could find all kinds of groups in the past who have been sort of targets in that way. And it might be worth thinking about whether a memorial would be appropriate, just to remind us of the danger of a moral panic.
Thank you very much. So Jeanette is saying, first of all, a great talk. She says, King James's brother-in-law, Christian IV of Denmark, was also known for witch trials. Do we know if they influenced each other, and if so, who started it?
Well, this is a really interesting question, because of course James, when he goes to get Anne, ends up, for having, partially because of bad weather, spending quite a bit of time with Danes and Norwegians. And there's some interesting discussions about what they talk about. To the extent that we have records, James seems to be much more interested in talking about things like predestination. So it's very theological sort of conversations. But I think you're probably right. There was conversation there. But the reality is the elite thinking that there is an issue that they're worried about is pan-European. And at least in the sense of wherever you have Latin Christianity. It's very interesting that this is not really a feature of Orthodox Christianity. So Latin Christianity, whether it's Catholicism or Protestantism, sort of has a bugbear about this, and is convinced that there is a danger of conspiracies of witches. So when I said that James writes this book he does, there's almost nothing original in the book whatsoever. He's cobbling together stuff that people have been writing for the previous, well, almost century. But it just gives you an idea that these ideas are just rumbling around, and by and large, everyone buys into them. Notable exceptions. Reginald Scott writes a really cool book where he basically says, you people are just targeting little old women and killing them, and there's no such thing, and this is just made up. Interestingly enough, James spends a great deal of time in his treatise explaining why Reginald Scott is awful.
Thank you very much. Fanny has another question. First of all, she says thank you for answering the last one. She says, are there any records of Charles I, or Henry for that matter, engaging with the issue of witches, or was this not an issue anymore when they were old enough to care about it?
Certainly there's, well, Charles, of course, spends most of his time in England, and one of the interesting things is that England is an outlier, in that although it has witches, because of the different legal structure in England, it never seems to be very interested in the demonic pact. So a witch in England is someone that makes your cow not give milk or makes your baby get ill, and that's it. You never go down the road of did you go to a dinner party with Satan and have sex with him. Whereas that's in Scotland and that's on the continent, and it does seem to be partially because Scotland, like the continent, is plugged into Roman law, and therefore has a different sort of approach to things than in England. So I think that probably explains why Charles isn't particularly interested. And there is sort of a gap in Scotland between 1591, 1597, the big witch trials then, and then the sort of last big outbreak, which is in the 1640s during the Civil War Commonwealth period. So it's partially lack of opportunity, but I think also he's in a different jurisdiction, which approaches the whole thing in a very different way.
Great, thank you. Philippa says, a great presentation, thank you. She's asking, were there similar witch hunts in and around other cities in Scotland? Or was there something peculiar around Aberdeen that led to over 30 women being found guilty and executed?
No. So what's interesting is there is a more general witch hunt around all of Scotland in 1597. It breaks down into kind of two halves. January to June is Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire. May and onwards is the rest of Scotland. So it's obvious that what happens is everyone in Scotland hears about what's going on in Aberdeen and thinks, oh my goodness, there must be a problem. And then they are sensitized to this. And rather like in the 1950s, all of a sudden there's a communist under every bed. So there is a connection. And you do see this very often in other parts of Scotland. So 1591 is mostly North Berwick, but then it becomes more diffuse across Scotland. You see this on the continent as well. People hear about a big spectacular witch hunt and they get very worried. And I see the next question is about garroting. Garroting is just quite simply strangling someone. So they're tied to the stake. The executioner gets behind them, takes a rope and strangles them while they're stuck to the stake.
Thank you. She did actually clarify later that she just wasn't keen on Googling that, which makes sense. So the next question is from Sheila, and she says, were men accused of witchcraft?
Yes, indeed they are. As far as we can tell, about 20% of the people accused and probably about the same number convicted and executed are men. In most cases where we can tell, they have some sort of connection to a woman who's accused about the same time. So quite often a son, the mother's accused and the son is accused. More often the wife is accused and then the husband is accused. Now there's sort of two notable exceptions to this. In Iceland, almost everyone accused of witchcraft is a man. And in Normandy, it's not only a man, but it's almost always a man who's a shepherd. We don't really know why, but you don't want to be a shepherd in Normandy when people are getting concerned about witches because they're going to go for you. So there are some sort of peculiarities, but yes, men are accused, but they normally are sort of caught up in a hunt rather than being initially targeted by it.
Great, thank you. Jock is asking, how similar or different to the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts was what happened here in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire?
Well, it's very interesting because very often the Salem trials are sort of seen as one of the last sort of big outbreaks, but there are some problems there. If you look at the Salem trials, they are much more about possession and diabolical possession than the demonic pact. And it is true that in the later 17th century, 18th century, you do get a sort of fad for diabolical possession. So there's a couple of notorious cases where entire convents in France and Italy all of a sudden have this outbreak of diabolical possession. So although the Salem trials are seen as witch trials, they are slightly different because what you have by and large are young girls who claim that they have been possessed by a demon as the result of someone putting a curse on them. That's not really what you see in sort of, if you will, your standard witchcraft trial of the 16th and 17th century in the rest of Europe. there's obvious similarities and there's obviously a sort of organic connection, but there are some really important differences between them.
Thank you very much. John is asking, did the Protestant Reformation account to some extent for the increase in the cases of witchcraft?
I don't think so. Now, as I said, the Spanish Inquisition stops prosecuting witches at about 1610, and it takes Protestant Europe about another generation to come to the same conclusions. But if you look at the treatises that are produced by Protestants about witchcraft, they are almost entirely reprints or plagiarisms of Catholic treatises that are earlier. So this shift to thinking there's a problem, we've got an issue, there's a conspiracy, is taking place 1490 to 1500, so half a generation before the Reformation. And in fact, Protestant and Catholic municipalities and jurisdictions cooperate in witch hunts. So you might be able to say that Protestants, it's prolonged more in Protestant areas. I'm not sure that that's necessarily because they're Protestant, but so causation and correlation. But it is certainly the case that Protestant jurisdictions are slightly later in coming to the conclusion that they can't really get a safe confession than some Catholic jurisdictions are, but there are exceptions.
Hayden is asking, were these executions carried out in public as a deterrent or something alike, or were they carried out in private?
Well, executions were public. They were spectacular public events. In fact, there's a whole historiographical literature on executions as spectacles, as shows, and people brought their children, and they brought picnics, and the accusation was read out in a loud voice. So effectively, you could take your children along and say, "See, if you do that, this is what happens to you." And they were meant to be horrific. I mean, strangling someone at the stake is not fast. In the same way that hanging, in this period, hanging is not a drop where your neck breaks. Hanging is you're pushed off of a ladder and effectively strangled while you're hanging there. So these are unpleasant executions to watch, and they are meant to be unpleasant.
That's great, thank you very much. I see our good friend June is here. Hello, June. She's her question. She's just wondering what happened to the remains of the witches once they were burned, and also did their guilt affect the rest of the family later on?
Their ashes are simply scattered, and again, that's part of the horror of being burned at the stake. Is that you don't get anything like a decent burial. You're just disposed of. It's hard to say that the guilt affects their relatives, but it taints their relatives. And people know if your mother or your sister was an accused witch or an executed witch. And it just means that you're more likely to fit that profile if they come looking again.
Very much. Craig is asking, he says that I'm a descendant of Christian Mitchell, one of the executed witches. Really is interested to find out more. Can you recommend some sources?
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'm just going to type the two names I mentioned earlier. So Julian Goodare and Peter Maxwell Stewart, who wrote 2 articles about this in the journal. See, typing and speaking at the same time, it's hard to do. Oops. I managed to go incognito, and I have no idea how I did that. So if you're interested, that's where I would go. I don't know whether you have access as a guest reader through the university online system, but if you do, both of those are available online.
Thank you very much for that. Let's see whose question's next. Sheila is asking, when did the concept of white or good witches come in?
Again, this is something that is much more associated with the 19th century and this rise of sort of interest in paganism and stuff like that. You do get discussions about the ability of witches in demonological treatises to do good and what this means. And it's normally interpreted that Satan gives them the power to do good because that then deludes people into following them. So, the idea that Satan can cast out demons, that Satan can raise the dead, this is something that you get even in the early church. So the question is who's doing it? Who gives you the power to do it? So they understand that witches can do good things. And in the local community, that is kind of like a white witch, in the sense that they're a witch doctor and they do good things. From the point of view of the elite's understanding of what's going on, it's very different. I'll give you an example of how I quite often explain that. We all understand that there's a thing called electricity. And you know that if you turn a light switch on, the electricity produces light, which is good. But you also know that if you stick your fingers in a wall socket, the same electricity knocks you across the room. That's bad. So electricity is in and of itself morally neutral. It's how you use it that's good or bad. I think that's how most people, in the sense in a village, understand the power of these witches. The power is morally neutral. It's what they do with it. The elite has a very different understanding. The elite says, that electricity, does it come from a nice, clean wind farm, or does it come from a dirty coal factory? And that's what's the interest to them. They don't care whether it's doing good or bad. They want to know where the electricity comes from. So they don't care that the witch is curing small children or making the cows give milk. Their question is yeah, but how does she do that? And it's because she's in league with Satan.
Thank you very much. Susan's saying, isn't there already a memorial on the esplanade of Edinburgh Castle?
There might well be. I haven't the faintest idea.
Lorna is asking, what role did the Reformation and split in church have? I have read that the two churches use these events and witch trials as perverse advertising for their brand. Any truth in this?
No, not really. As I said, they cooperate in witch hunts. There's no real sense in which Protestants are saying, that witch is doing, is somehow a closet Catholic. Some of their practices may be read as being traditional Catholic practices, but that's not really the main issue. And to give you an example of just how indifferent they are, in early demonological treatises, the reason you know that the Sabbath is bad is because it is the inverse of a Catholic Mass. So instead of worshiping God, you worship Satan. Instead of eating the host, you eat a baby, that kind of stuff. When Protestants comes along and they write their demonological treatises, they keep that. And you think, well, they don't like the Mass, and they don't like the thing that's the antithesis of the Mass. And somehow that doesn't seem to ever click in their minds that doesn't make any sense if you're a Protestant. And that's why I think, because I just don't think they see this in the same way. This is someone in league with Satan. They understand that in extreme things they might call the Pope, the Antichrist, but they don't see this as being the same sort of thing.
Thank you very much. And just so everyone knows that Rosemary's put a link in the chat as well, the campaign she was speaking about earlier about a memorial, so you can have a look at that if you like. Sophie is saying it's interesting to hear the differences between Scotland and England in relation to this. What was the situation in Wales and Ireland?
And in fact, Gwendolyn's question next is very, very sort of similar. So the big difference is the English system is just straight common law. And whereas in Scotland, you've got a sort of mix of common law and Roman law. And Wales and Ireland are effectively English common law. So the big difference is that in the English system, when you're convicting someone, you're going for, if you will, balance of probability, no reasonable doubt. So if the local community thinks that a person has made a cow go dry, they can accuse the person, and then the judge, who will normally be on a circuit and not from the community, is there at the assize, and the jury unlike our concept of the jury in this period is people from the local community who effectively work as advisors to the judge. So someone will say, this person made my cow go dry. The person says, I didn't make the cow go dry. The judge then turns to the jury and goes, which is it? The jury knows the people. And so if the balance of probability is they made the cow go dry, then they can be prosecuted for that. That's sufficient. Whereas if the balance of probability is that they didn't, then that's the end of the trial. In Scotland, you have to prove, as on the continent. You have to actually prove, which is why Scotland still has 3 verdicts: guilty, innocent, and not proven. So that's why you need a confession, because under Roman law, to convict someone, you either need 2 eyewitnesses or you need a confession. Well, 2 eyewitnesses to flying through the air and having dinner with Satan is kind of hard to find. So you need, so the accusation about the cow going dry can start the investigation. If you're really going to get a conviction, you need a confession. And what you need the person to confess to is something that effectively is a kind of a cast iron confession. And since they already know the answers, that's what you get when you ask about the demonic pact.
Thank you very much. Richard is asking, so it says there was a sex abuse panic in Orkney in 1991 with satanic rituals mentioned. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, to me, this is the same kind of moral panic. And what is very interesting about that is the subsequent sort of inquest into what went on there found some very interesting things. First of all, apparently no evidence that it actually really happened. But more importantly, most of the people that were accused were incomers, and that there's something going on there. So the people who were questioning the children weren't doing it in a way, they were giving leading questions and they were leading things and the children were responding to that, all of that sort of stuff. But also there was an incomer local sort of element to it. And that actually fits the pattern of a moral panic generally, not just the kind I'm talking about of the witch trial, but just generally moral panic. When you have a moral panic, you look for who to blame for things. And very often it's not people like you.
That's great, thank you. George is asking, was Margaret Bain's offence anything to do with the fact that she was a midwife?
And again, an excellent question. Yes, almost certainly. If you were to say, what profession fits the profile of witch, midwife is there. So not all accused witches are midwives, because quite often we don't know what they were, if they were anything, and not all midwives ever get accused of witchcraft. But it's one of those things that sort of fits the profile. And the reason is because from the point of view of the elite, midwifery is one of the things the elite, and the elite are all men, know nothing about. It's a secret thing that goes on outside of their ken. And midwifery quite often involves ritual in this period. And very often snatches of prayers and things like that. So, I mean, it might strike us as strange, but if you think about, okay, the midwife mixes up something that might have a bit of an opiate in it to ease pain, and you think, okay, that's why it works. That's not why the midwife and the person getting it think it's work. They think it works because of when she has picked the ingredients, how she's mixed them together, what words she said while she was doing it. In other words, the ritual is an essential ingredient into making it operative. And because midwives do lots of stuff like that, it kind of makes them slightly suspicious anyway. But a good thing to have around.
Very true. Thank you. So just so everyone knows, Philip has just pointed out, just to confirm, that there is a plaque on the east end of the Esplanade in Edinburgh Castle for the Edinburgh witches as a memorial. So you can go and look at that next time you're in Edinburgh. Sheena's asking, were there links in Aberdeen with the Craiglash Coven and Colin Massey?
I don't know. That's the simple and honest answer.
Okay, thanks.
They're not mentioned in either of the 2 articles that I typed out for you, and those are the main sources available to anyone who wants to look at this at the moment.
Thank you. Jay is asking, was there a similar incomer-outcomer thing in the 1957 trials? Sorry, the 1597 trials, as in Orkney.
No, it doesn't appear to be the case. I mean, there it does look much more as though it has to do with sort of pre-existing connections with witches in some way, and particularly to do with social status. So if you've got some status, you tend to get protected. If you don't have some status, you're more likely. And it certainly, from, as you can see from where they went wandering about, rural people are more likely to get it than urban people.
Katie is asking, was there a minimum age someone could be convicted of witchcraft?
Not that I know of. You don't see children being convicted, but remember the sort of age of responsibility in this period is much lower than we would ever understand. I mean, people can be executed for theft when they're 12, sort of stuff. So, and they do tend to make a distinction in their mind between a child and an adolescent. In fact, Calvin is actually asked about this once, and he says there's sort of, if you will, sort of three categories. There's the child who doesn't understand and isn't capable of doing doing crimes. Then there's the adolescent who's capable, and he's actually talking about sexual crimes at this point, who's capable in the sense of physically capable, but might not understand exactly the implications of what they're doing. And then there's adults who are physically capable and understand the implications. And he kind of says, the children, you don't do anything to. The adults, you prosecute and punish normally, but the adolescents you kind of deal with in a sort of ad hoc, case-by-case basis.
Thank you very much. Who's next? Matt is asking, what happened to those accused who refused to confess, or was there anyone like that at all?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that if you could manage not to confess, the chances were pretty high that you would just be acquitted. And you see this not only with witchcraft trials, you see it with lots of trials in the early modern period all across Europe. Even where there is judicial torture, if you resist 3 applications of judicial torture without changing your testimony, the chances are you're just going to be acquitted. Because they do understand that people will confess to things under coercion, in the sense of judicial torture, which is why they don't ask leading questions. And one of the things the Spanish Inquisition realizes is because everyone knows the answers about the pact and things like that, effectively every question about it is a leading question. So that's why they quit. So people do resist judicial torture. Now, the thing is extrajudicial torture is really interesting because, of course, depriving someone of sleep, depriving them of food, and depriving them of drink, they don't perceive of that as being torture. But we know that this makes you incredibly susceptible to suggestion and indeed to hallucination, which in the context of a witchcraft trial and having chats with Satan is kind of what you don't ever want to have happen.
Yeah, that would be bad. Okay, so that seems to be all the questions. Has anyone got anything else before we wrap up? Still got some time. Okay, so Katie is saying, did you ever come across the, oh, sorry, it just moved, ever come across the Spalding Club binders in the university library?
Yeah, the Spalding Club is where you find extracts of a lot of materials, including trials. They're very useful. They can be problematic because they tend to be what people in the 19th and early 20th century thought was interesting. And they very often extract in a way to highlight the things that they found interesting when they read original sources, and which, if you read them, you might think, how did you miss that out? It's because in the 19th century that didn't interest them.
Philippa, first of all, she says, Bill is still as knowledgeable as he was when I spent time with him in Boston. 10 years ago.
Good to hear from you.
Thank you for the discussion. So the next question is from Anne, and she's asking, is there any evidence that the accused did have any extra special powers, i.e. were they magical?
Well, I mean, that would be hard to know. But you're touching on something that is a real issue. And if you read Maxwell Stewart and Julian Goodare, you realize that they take a very different view of this. And in fact, they fundamentally disagree. So the question that arises is did anyone think they were a witch? Now, if you mean in the sense of way the elite understood it, was anyone running around thinking I've had a sort of a signed a contract with Satan and gone to parties and had sex with Satan and eaten babies? I don't think so. If you mean, did someone think that they could manipulate unseen forces by certain rituals, by certain activities, by certain words? Probably. Because in actual fact, everyone in this period thinks that that's possible. That's fundamentally what a priest does when they turn bread into the body of Christ. They're accessing, if you will, electricity, but their electricity is coming from a good source. So I think it's important to remember that there's a distinction here, and it's easy to conflate what the elite mean by demonic, contractual, satanic witchcraft, and what most people I think probably meant, which was simply the manipulation of the powers that exist around everyone. So in the same way that we would say, do you think second sight is real? Well, my answer to that would be, I don't know. But do I think that there are people who think they have second sights? Yes.
Great, thank you very much. I think that is all the questions. We're being flooded with everyone saying how fascinating and interesting and wonderful it was, which I absolutely have to agree with.
Well, I'm so pleased that so many of you came along to listen. Thank you very much.
It was honestly brilliant, so thank you so much. Yeah, all that's really left is for me to say a huge thank you to you, Bill, for spending the time with us this afternoon, and to everyone as well that took the time out of their day to come along and join us. It's been absolutely fascinating. We will email out tomorrow the recording, so you can watch it back again and relive it, and share it with other people as well. But I hope you guys have a lovely evening, and we'll maybe see you at another event soon. And take care.
Bye-bye.